we're at a point where Jesus is trying to teach his disciples who he is. All throughout the book of Mark, from the chapter 1 all the way up until now, there's been this question, Jesus, who are you? Who are you, Jesus? And a lot of people are still wrestling with that question today. Who is Jesus? Finally, we get to Mark chapter 8, and earlier in the chapter, it's surrounded by Jesus heals somebody who's blind, and then he heals somebody who's deaf. He heals a blind man, heals a deaf man, and then his disciples, his followers, the people closest to him, do not understand who he is still. And he looks at them and says, having eyes, do you not see? Having ears, do you not hear? In other words, you guys have all the senses. You guys are following me. You guys should know who I am. Until finally, after this identity of Jesus is kind of not in question, but the identity of Jesus is being discovered, he comes to this passage in Mark chapter 8, verse 27. Jesus flat out asks, "And Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way, he asked his disciples, 'Who do people say that I am?' And they told him, 'Some say you're John the Baptist. Others say you're Elijah. And others one of the prophets.' But he asked them," so Jesus is asking his disciples, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him. Of course, Peter's always the first one to speak up. Peter answered him, "You are the Christ." Now, Peter got that right. Christ means the Messiah, the promised one, the Redeemer that's promised to pay the price to pay for the sin of all mankind. Peter got that right. You are the Christ. You imagine how refreshing that would be to Jesus. Finally, somebody knows who I am, right? But look what he says next. Verse 30. And he strictly charged them to tell no one about him. Why would he do that? That's the polar opposite of what we're supposed to do now. Later on, he commissions the church at the end of all four Gospels, go and tell everybody about me. Every time we close a service here at Central, we say, you are sent to tell everybody about Jesus, about who he is. So why would Jesus say, don't tell anybody? That's fascinating. It's not what you would expect. You would expect him to say something like, finally, I'm glad you understand, Peter. Now make sure everybody else understands and go tell everybody. He says the exact opposite. What's going on here? So with those question marks kind of over our head, let's continue reading. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. Jesus did not just want Peter to go tell everybody that I'm the Christ. Great. What does that mean? What is the Christ here to do? What is the mission of Jesus? And then he says, now that you know that I'm the Christ, let me tell you this stuff also, then go tell everybody. Now, when they say you are the Christ, they want Jesus to overthrow Rome and become the new world emperor. That's what they have in their minds when they say the Messiah. They were looking for a political leader. They were looking for a political leader. So the fact that Jesus said and began to teach them about the Son of Man must suffer many things. Hang on, suffer? You're Jesus. You're God in the flesh. You're the Messiah. You didn't come to suffer. You came to conquer. And Jesus saying, hang on a second. I need to teach you what it means that I'm the Christ, he's saying. The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders. Those are the current religious leaders, and the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed. And the 3 days later rise again. Now look at verse 32. And he said this plainly. In other words, there's often times when Jesus is teaching, Jesus will teach using a parable, a metaphor, for example. Okay, he didn't say that this time. He just flat out said, yes, you're right, I'm the Christ. And you know what? I'm going to suffer and I'm going to die. And all the chief priests and the scribes and the religious rulers, the elders, they're all going to turn on me and they are going to kill me. But don't worry, when that happens, 3 days later, I'm going to rise again. Now, Peter's the first one to speak up on this. That wasn't what they were expecting to hear from Jesus. What does your identity mean? It means he's going to suffer and die and then rise again. And Jesus said this plainly, so everybody understood what he was saying. Let's continue verse 32. And he said this plainly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Peter's correcting Jesus. But Peter wanted to be spiritual. Well, Jesus, you need some correction. You're wrong about that, but I'm not going to correct you in front of everybody else. Jesus, do you have a minute? Yeah, come over here. I'm not going to correct you publicly, but I just want to let you know, you're not going to suffer and die. That's not what's going to happen. You're wrong about that, Jesus. Think about that. He actually took Jesus aside and rebuked Jesus. You don't do that. That's a big no-no. Jesus is God. He's always right. He's righteous. He cannot lie. Verse 33 now. But turning and seeing his disciples. So Jesus said, that's all communication there. He's saying, you want to take me out to side? I'm going to look at the disciples and bring them back in on the conversation. So everybody knows when he says, get behind me, Satan, for you're not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of the man. And then look what Jesus does. He not only looks at the disciples, verse 34, he calls the crowd to him with his disciples. He said, this conversation is not a private conversation. Don't you take me over here privately. I'm looking at the disciples and I want all the crowd to gather. Listen, everybody needs to hear this. You see, what Jesus is doing is polar opposite of Peter. Jesus is correcting Peter. Peter wanted a private conversation. Jesus said, disciples, crowd, everybody come. Everybody needs to hear this. This is the heart of the passage, verse 34. And calling the crowd to him with his disciples, he said to them, so now Jesus is teaching, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. Is that what you have in mind when you think of following Jesus? In other words, Jesus is saying, he's elaborating on what he said of himself. Now that you know I'm the Christ, guess what's going to happen? I'm going to suffer. I'm going to be betrayed. I'm going to die. The third day, I'm going to rise again. And if you want to follow me, you must be willing to deny yourself, to take up your cross and follow me. It's the same thing. He's elaborating on that and saying that command to suffer is not just for Jesus, it is for his followers. In fact, I think I said this last week. If I can nerd out for a minute, in this passage, all the way, we're going to look at verse 27 all the way through verse 13. There are 4 imperative verbs. 3 of them are in this passage, in this verse. An imperative verb conveys a command. It's a command. So if we wonder where the heart of everything from verse 27 to 9:13, which is what we're going to look at, all the commands, the takeaways, the meat of the sandwich is right here in these verbs. Deny yourself. Take up your cross. Follow me. Those are the commands given to the followers of Jesus. The question is, what does that mean for us? Crucifixion is no longer around. Certainly not here in America, yet. That was a joke. What does this mean for us, though? Something that's in its historical context. I mean, let's be honest with ourselves. It's a lot easier to follow Jesus now than it was in this time. Following Jesus in this time meant the death sentence. But Jesus says, if you want to follow me, you need to deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. A disciple is a good word, but it's a church word. A disciple means a committed follower of Jesus. And discipleship is being a disciple, being a committed follower of Jesus. We have one-on-one discipleship at this church where we'll open the scriptures and go through a book and alongside it and teach you what it means to be a committed follower of Jesus. And what is the model of discipleship? What does a follower of Jesus look like? He gives us the prescription for that right here. Deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. Discipleship is a call to glory by way of suffering. Following Jesus is a call to glory by way of suffering, you see. Notice Jesus says, I'm going to suffer, I'm going to die, but the third day I'm going to rise again. And he's saying that same pattern right here. Deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. And we're going to go into the glory here in a minute to follow. But we cannot get to the glory before we deal with these commands in this passage. These imperative verbs, these commands that God has given us today. To deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow Jesus. What does it mean to deny yourself? What Jesus calls for is not a denial of things in our life. It's not, I really want to go to Steve's Dakota Grill for lunch, but I'm going to deny myself. And we'll go to Taco Bell instead. We'll go home, right? That's not the kind of denying yourself. It's not denying yourself things. I really want to purchase whatever it is. I really want, but I'm going to deny myself. That's not the kind of denial that's talked about here. It's not talking about denying yourself things. It's the denial of oneself. You deny yourself you. You deny yourself your own desires, opinions. You deny yourself your claiming rights. You deny yourself your privileges particular to your position in life. Self-denial involves the willingness not affirm any right to life. Think about that. That's what he says when he says, take up your cross. That was a death sentence. You need to deny yourself of yourself. See, this is the polar opposite of self-affirmation, which is so popular today. Of putting value on one's being, on one's life. This says you need to deny yourself. You see, self-denial obviously involves the willingness not to affirm any rights. It's an inner attitude. It's the cross-bearing in our hearts that is the outward activity which should accompany the inner attitude. So in other words, let me just put it in today's term. Let me just put this in 2024 in Marion, Ohio. What if there's something you feel very strongly about? I mean, that you feel very, very strongly about it. It's personal to you. It's in your heart. It's a core value of what you believe. That's not in the Bible, let's say. Just something you feel very strongly about. And it doesn't work out how you like it. What do you do? How do you handle times like that? When there's something we feel very strongly about, and it's not happening the way it should. Not the way I want. Not the way it's supposed to go. It's the kind of things that just eat you up. That's not right. It should be right. Self-denial rids yourself of all of that. That's what self-denial is. How do you react to situations where you have strong feelings but things don't go your way? That is self-denial. That's the kind of self-denial it's talking about here. There are people who have decided to stop following Jesus because things don't go their way. And that's what Jesus is doing some pre-work here. He's doing some what we would call preventative maintenance. Before you go following me, he says, you better get used to this. Get used to denying yourself. You can't follow Jesus out of a mutual agreement. That will not last. That's not the model of discipleship. Jesus calls people to follow him out of total surrender to him, not out of mutual agreement. I've spoken with many people who have stopped following Jesus because something did not go their way. And this is not to bash them. By the way, if that's you, God can restore you. And he wants to restore you. Look what happened to Peter later on. Peter's in this. You can read ahead. Many of you know the story already. Things didn't go Peter's way after Jesus was crucified. He denied Christ, and then he said, I'm going fishing. Jesus called Peter. Peter, I want you back. Why don't you feed my sheep? Why don't you do what I called you to do? See, God can restore those who are far from him. But the truth still stands that many people have stopped following Jesus because something did not go their way. Some have thought, if I follow Jesus, my life's going to be easier. And when they found out that there are still challenges in life when you follow Jesus, you'll check out and stop following Jesus. Some maybe didn't get a prayer answered. Let me take that back. They did get it answered, but it wasn't the answer they wanted. So they stopped following Jesus. Some, maybe their church made a decision they didn't like, so they checked out and stopped following Jesus. Some maybe just had a general bad experience, so they check out and stop following Jesus. In each of these examples, the problem is not the bad experience. The problem is not with their answer to prayer. It's not with their church. The problem is not with how easy their life is. The problem in each of these examples is they have not learned to deny themselves. They have not learned to deny themselves. You cannot follow Jesus without denying yourself. Now, what is self-denial? Self-denial doesn't mean you deny yourself things like luxuries and possessions. Self-denial means you deny yourself. Once again, it's the opposite of self-affirmation. You deny yourself of your claiming rights. You deny yourself of your position. You deny yourself of your own opinions. To deny yourself means to deny your rights, even when you're suffering. By the way, that's exactly what Jesus did. Remember, I'm going to suffer, and I'm going to be turned on by the religious leaders. And they're even going to put me to death. The model of Jesus Christ is self-denial to the point of death. True disciples do not fight for their own opinions, passions, or causes. True disciples deny themselves and pick up their crosses and get in line behind Jesus. That's what true disciples, that's what Jesus is calling everybody to be. That concept is foreign to us today, though. It's not popular. And can I tell you, I wish I can say it was popular back then. No, it really wasn't. It wasn't popular then either. Burger King's slogan is famous, "Have it your way." In the 1970s, Burger King came out with that slogan, and what it was designed to do was to highlight their flexibility compared to their competitors. If you were to go to a fast food restaurant and you ordered a hamburger, you didn't get any choice on the toppings. You ordered a hamburger, it was whatever it came with, boom. Burger King was the first fast food restaurant to allow you to modify your order. Can I have triple pickles on that? Can you have no cheese and hold the onions, or maybe the onions on the side? Can I have extra ketchup and no mustard? See, that was frowned upon in the fast food business because it was going to make their times where they served people in their drive-through catastrophic through the roof. It's much faster in the kitchen. You just prepare it. If they order a hamburger, it's a hamburger, and what they order is what they get. But Burger King was revolutionary. First one, have it your way. Until people started getting it their way. and their drive-through times went through the roof. Through the roof. And what was intended to actually help them hurt them, because people were customizing orders so much that they couldn't keep up with the orders they were doing. And then they would get it wrong. And if you order something custom and you get it wrong, people are twice as mad. So it ended up, they ended up like they got themselves in a pickle, pun intended. They got themselves in a pickle. And for years, Burger King went through no less than 4 different other slogans to try to get away from "have it your way," because they wanted people to stop doing that because they couldn't keep up. Every other slogan failed. And to this day, "have it your way" is back. Have it your way. Let's be honest. We all like things our way. Everybody likes things their way. But when you follow Jesus, it's not about "have it our way." It's about Jesus, "have it your way." That is the model for discipleship. It is denying yourself. Now, let's think about this. We deny yourself in the next phrase, and take up his cross. Now, I've heard that read and preach, and I've heard that as like a metaphor. Well, it doesn't really mean take up your cross. What it means is, deal with the tough situations in your life. Oh, I have an intusion. That's like a bruised muscle, and those actually hurt, by the way. Oh, this is my cross to bear. It's not what it's talking about. Now, that's not to negate any issues or anything like that. But when it says, take up your cross, that's not a metaphor. Mark was written after Jesus' death. Jesus was teaching this, but when Mark wrote this, it was between the years of 55 and 70 AD. That is falls under the reign of one of 2 Roman emperors. One was Nero, who reigned, I got the dates, hang on. I couldn't memorize them though. Nero reigned from 55 to 69 AD, and Vespasian followed him from 69 AD to 79 AD. Somewhere in that window of 55 to 70 AD, the Gospel of Mark was written. So when we read this, take up your cross, to us, we're tempted to treat it like a metaphor. But to these people here, the Roman Emperor Nero was known for not only crucifying Christians, but lighting the very cross they were crucified on fire while they were being crucified. Vespasian crucified hundreds of Christians. So when Mark was writing this, he was reminding people of his day. Remember when Jesus said, deny yourself. It's more than just this little preference thing. That's not what it's talking about. It's saying that we need to put ourselves, our preferences, out of the equation so much that we are so dedicated to Jesus Christ that if you are on Emperor Nero or Vespasian's list, you willingly submit yourself to death and suffering because of the example of Jesus Christ. That is the biblical standard for discipleship. That's what that passage means. To take up your cross was not a metaphor. It was literal. Under the emperors there were saying, you could be next. Is Jesus still worth following? Is he still worth following? You see, the model for discipleship is suffering first, but then we're going to get to it. Hang on. Glory later. We're going to get to that too. But we can't overlook these imperatives, these verbs, these commands that Jesus gives all of his followers. You must be willing to deny yourself, to take up, that's the verb, your cross, and follow. And follow. The mark of discipleship is to deny yourself to the point you are willing to die for Jesus. Get in line behind Jesus. He is the example. That still leaves the question, why should you deny yourself to the point where you're willing to die for Jesus Christ? Why should we deny ourselves and take up our cross and follow Jesus? Let's face it, we don't live in a time where crucifixion is really popular, okay? We're still faced with this historical cultural gap that we're in Marion, Ohio today, or you're watching online wherever you are, but you're not in 55 or 60 AD when this was written. We're not in a time where Vespasian or Nero doesn't rule here, right? So there's still some in the language here. Why should this sounds so extreme? It sounds radical. Let's be honest. This kind of following Jesus, that kind of dedication sounds radical to us. But in this, that's biblical Christianity. That's not radical Christianity. That's biblical Christianity. But what he's saying here is, why should we follow Jesus? Let's look at Jesus' continued life. Verse 35. For whoever would save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake will save it. For what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? For what can a man give in return for his own soul? For whosoever shall be ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of whom shall the Son of Man be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father and the holy angels? Let's continue reading, chapter 9. And he said to them, so this is still the same lesson here. It's a different chapter, but this is all the same lesson Jesus is teaching. He says, truly I say to you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the kingdom of God after it has come with power. What does that mean? Does that mean the end times have already happened? I mean, this is one of the most misunderstood verses. What does that mean? Jesus actually said there are people that are physically hearing him that lesson that day who are not going to see death until they see the kingdom of God after it has come with power. You want to know what it means? Look at the next verse. Verse 2. And after 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John. Now listen, he talked to a huge crowd. And Jesus said, there are some here, not all, but some, who are going to see something special, basically. Paraphrasing there. And then he takes Peter, James, and John. So this is it being lived out right here. And led them up to a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them. And his clothes became radiant, intensely white, as no one on earth could bleach them. What a glorious scene. And there appeared with them Elijah and Moses, and they were talking with Jesus. Would you like to be there? This description is astonishing enough already. But imagine if you were one of the ones that Jesus said, there are some here that are not going to die until they see the kingdom of God, until it comes with full power. By the way, 6 days later, Peter, James, John, come with me. We're going to go up to a mountain. And as they went up, and after they were up there, Jesus was transfigured. Now, that's not a word we commonly use. What does that mean? It means that Jesus was actually showing his glory as fully God at that time. Now, listen, this is very important. Jesus is eternally God, always has been eternally God. God is a Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Not three different gods. Not one God who goes into different modes. He's in spirit mode now, and then he morphs into Jesus mode. God's not a transformer, okay? That's modalism. That's heresy. If God goes into different modes. The baptism of Jesus is an excellent example. Jesus is physically there being baptized. The Holy Spirit descends like a dove, and they hear the voice from heaven, all three persons of the Godhead in one scene. Not in different modes. Jesus is fully God. I've heard it described before. Jesus left his glory above when he came to earth. Ooh, no he didn't. That's heresy. Jesus did not cease to be God when he came to earth. His glory was veiled in flesh when he took on flesh. And what happens at this transfiguration? Jesus lifts the veil and doesn't just do a miracle, he starts shining. It was so white and so bright, and his glory was so intense, it was never seen before on this earth. That colors couldn't do it. Unbelievable. It's very similar to when Moses saw the hind parts of God. That Moses' face shone. In fact, that's kind of a typology here. We don't have time to go into it today, but that's a picture of exactly what happens. Very similar. Very similar. But this one is better. This one is better. In other words, why should you follow Jesus and dedicate your life to Jesus and do all of that, denying yourself and taking up your cross and follow Jesus? Jesus gave Peter, James, and John just a snapshot of his glory that they will behold and worship for all of eternity. There's probably some people in here that probably have some tough lives. A crowd this size. We'd be foolish to think somebody in here is not going through a big trial. Not going through a time where maybe they can even identify, maybe I'm not physically carrying a cross, but maybe emotionally, maybe relationally. However, is it really worth following Jesus? When you get a glimpse of the glory of God that you will be in the presence of for all eternity, there is no amount of suffering or self-denial that's too much. None. None. That's why Mark records it. It was only 6 days later. Jesus is saying, you need to deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. And by the way, I'm going to give you a sneak preview coming soon. And then 6 days later, there's that post-credits scene in the mountain. Jesus takes Peter, James, and John, unveils himself, and shows his glory. Now, how do they respond to this? Verse 6, verse 4. No, verse 6. Verse 5. Let me go in between. And Peter said to Jesus, Rabbi, that's to say teacher, it's good that we're here. Let us make 3 tents, one for Moses and one for Elijah, and one for you. He didn't know what to say. He's terrified. Take a lesson from Peter. If you don't know what to say, don't say anything at all. There's a proverb that says, even a fool, if he stays quiet, is counted wise. Right? He didn't know what to say, so he started talking, and he said something really bad. Wow, we saw Jesus, we saw Moses, we saw Elijah. Let's make 3 tents, one for each of you. Peter's corrected again. This time it's not by God the Son, it's by God the Father. Look what happened. Verse 7 now. And a cloud overshadowed them, and a voice came out of the cloud. This is my beloved Son. Listen, by the way, that's the last imperative verb, the 4th imperative verb. Listen to him. And suddenly looking around, they no longer saw anyone with them but Jesus only. In other words, here's what happened. God the Father, obviously he's omniscient. That means he's omniscience. All right, omniscient, that's the root word, science, and he knows everything. God the Father knows everything. He knew what Peter said. Oh, you want to build 3 tabernacles, 3 booths, 3 tents, one for Jesus, one for Moses, one for Elijah, has a light shine down, voice from heaven, same thing as Jesus' baptism, this is my beloved Son. Listen to him. There's the command. Listen to him. Listen to Jesus. Looking around, whoop, where's Moses? Where's Elisha? They're gone. In other words, Peter thought that Bible characters were the heroes and were to be equally looked at aside from Jesus. And God the Father corrects him and said, no. They're men of God, yes, but the best of men are men at best. The best of men are men at best. This is my beloved Son. That's Jesus. In other words, Moses is not the example. Elijah is not the example. Jesus is the example. And the example that we need to learn from Jesus is the self-denial. The self-denial. Sometimes we like to blame our sin on the devil. If the devil ceased to exist, I'd still sin. We all would. Sometimes the biggest enemy is ourself. That's why Jesus says, deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. And if that sounds like too much, it's not. Because let me give you a preview of what's going to come. So what are some takeaways from this passage? First, you should not leave grieving because it was a challenging truth. Instead, what we should leave is we should leave encouraged because the hope for future glory is far beyond anything God has for you in this life. Far beyond. By the way, Peter was the one speaking up here. Peter was the one speaking up. Peter was up there, saw the transfiguration. Whatever happened to Peter? After Peter forsook Jesus for a while, I'm going fishing. Jesus calls him back. Peter ended up coming back to Jesus as the pastor of the church at Babylon. That's modern day Iraq. Well, there was no persecution there like there is here today. Oh, yes, there was. In fact, Peter had to carry a cross too. And when Peter was crucified, this is what he said. Church history tells us, you're going to crucify me. I'm willing to be crucified, but I am not I'm not worthy to be crucified in the same way as Jesus. So crucify me upside down. And they put Peter's cross in upside down and was crucified upside down. I don't know about you. Sounds to me like what Peter saw, he put it together. He may have got a few things wrong, but it sounds to me like he put together that Jesus is worth living for. He's worth self-denial. Jesus is worth dying for. Peter was more encouraged by the future glory and motivated by that future glory than he was the trials of life. So be encouraged by the hope of your future glory. And then number 2, see every day from an eternal perspective. Eternal perspective. Look at life from the point of eternity. That's exactly what Jesus did when he showed his glory. He said, listen, you think the weights of this world, the trials, yes, they're real, yes. What you may be going through is real, is tough. After all, he says, deny yourself. That's why you have to deny yourself. But the glory that awaits you is worth it. It's worth it. When Jesus was transfigured, he was getting Peter, James, and John, he was getting their eyes off of the cross they have to bear and onto all of eternity. That's the difference. We can spend our whole lives either staring at our crosses or we can spend our lives looking at every day from an eternal perspective and looking forward to the glory of God that we will be able to praise him and worship him for all of eternity. The glory of Jesus Christ will last forever. All of the suffering we endure now is nothing considering the coming eternity with Jesus for those who choose to follow him. So how do you get through this present season of life? How do you get through seasons of suffering? You get through the present by hanging on to the future. By hanging on to the future, that's what Jesus was doing. So whatever the difficulties you face in life, God is the sovereign Lord of history. He will restore and reward all those who remain faithful to him. Simply put, Jesus is worth it. He is worth it. I have a hymn lyrics here. Don't worry, I ain't going to sing. But there's such powerful lyrics to this old-fashioned hymn. So I'm going to read it. The hymn is called, "It Will Be Worth It All." Sometimes the day seems long, our trials hard to bear. We're tempted to complain, to murmur and despair. But Christ will soon appear to catch his bride away. All tears forever over in God's eternal day. It will be worth it all when we see Jesus. Life's trials will seem so small when we see Christ. One glimpse of his dear face, all sorrow will erase. So bravely run the race until we see Christ.